Welcome to this special edition of Grab a Coffee. My name is Simon Kasiate, with my usual partner in crime,
Raymond Mujuni.
Incredible. And we normally ask when we begin the podcast how our week has been. Raymond, you certainly have been away, and I could smell your presence when I walked in here, a bit of jet fuel. Where have you been and what have you been doing?
Thank you so much, Simon. I've just come back from Kyiv and Poland. So I was in Ukraine and then I was in Poland. And both countries, as you might expect, have not had the best of weeks. And yes, that's where I've been. But you haven't been around yourself. Where have you been?
I was at the usual spot where you normally are, but this time not fomenting trouble. I was in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. It's been by coincidence that all the times I've been in Nairobi in the last 1 year, there is a strong demonstration led by Gen Zs on the streets. I must admit, I have nothing to do with whatever happens on the streets of Nairobi whenever I'm there. But for some reason, every time I'm in Nairobi, there's a demonstration, except this last time, this week. So that tells you, Raymond, that I've not been in any way associated with the troubles that take place in our neighboring country.
The week is only 2 days in, Simon. I still have more days. Thank you so much. This is a very special recording of the podcast today. As you might have guessed, today is the International Day of Democracy. Yesterday was the International Day of Democracy. Today is the day that we're celebrating it here. We are at the Swedish residence, engaging in grabbing very Swedish coffee. I'm not sure whether it's Swedish coffee or Ugandan coffee. But Simon, do you know that the Swedish have a very specific time in their day called fika for coffee?
Incredible.
Yes, so this is a fika moment for us. But we're joined by very impressive panelists that I want us to introduce one by one. I think we'll start with Mr. Daniel Kalinaki. If you could introduce yourself. It's very career limiting for me to try and introduce you, the way things look like.
I think you just did, Daniel Kalinaki.
No, I will not accept that.
Well, my name is Daniel Kalinaki, and my day job is to oversee the literary operations for Nation Media Group in Uganda. I also steer the Uganda Editors Guild. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much. And Professor William Taeba.
Thanks very much for promoting me. So I'm William Taeba. I am a teacher of journalism. A tough job at this point in time, but very exciting. But I was also practicing journalist with these wonderful people here. And I now head the university's publishing unit. So in addition to my job of teaching, I also head the publishing unit of the university. So if you have a book that you want published, it is welcome. And Raymond had already also introduced me as the board chair of the African Institute for Investigative Journalism, this wonderful group of very energetic and creative minds. So it's a very big honor to be here.
Great. So considering this seriousness of the conversation, you will allow me read my opening question, or at least set the rules from where I sit to all of us in the house. So I'll start by saying as follows. Press freedom is a cornerstone of democratic accountability and transparency. Yet it faces various challenges, especially during elections. Through this discussion, we explore the complexities, risks, and opportunities for press freedom in Uganda, seeking pathways to strengthen media's vital role in democratic processes. And so, we begin our conversation by my first question to Dr. William Taeba. Doctor, from where you sit in academia, but with years of experience in the newsroom, and the newsroom that includes running battles on the streets, especially during every election cycle, what would you, in just 2 minutes, be your snapshot of the situation around journalism, press freedom, and democratic practice in Uganda? Broadly.
Broadly, I think I will start from a report that just the 2025 World Press Freedom Index report released by Reporters Without Borders, Reporters Sans Frontières, which is a very, very sombering discovery for me to realize that Uganda had slid. Last year we were 128th we are now 143 out of 180. And what was even more somber to me was I am also visiting professor at University of Juba in South Sudan. So this year, we are behind South Sudan in terms of press freedom. So that can tell you where we are. And the index looks at so many factors. Looks at the environment. It starts with exactly what Her Excellency the Ambassador was talking about. The shrinking space for expression. My brother Robert Sempara, when you look at the number of journalists, look at Kawempe in March of this year, what happened. So I think from that perspective, you realize that we have a very serious problem of the shrinking space for freedom of expression, which is a cornerstone of any democracy. If you don't have a dynamic press where people have an opportunity to debate and engage in constructive conversations, then you cannot talk about a dynamic democracy. So that's a very big challenge that we have. But I think we should also move away from looking at just the manifestations of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and look at some of the structural and systemic issues. So I think for me, the biggest issue that I see to your question, Simon, is also when I look at the ownership model of the media in this country. So when we talk about freedom of expression and freedom of the press, and we forget the ownership model, then there is a problem. To realize that of the 300 radio stations in this country, more than 250 or thereabouts are owned by politicians, and politicians of a specific political persuasion. And related to that, the other balance is owned by either Pentecostal churches that are also aligned with the ruling party. Very few media houses that are owned by really private entities that would give us the space to have a meaningful conversation. So for me, that's even a very bigger problem to freedom, a bigger threat, the ownership regime that we have, than some of these manifestations that I've talked about.
William, before I allow Raymond to come in and fire away, when you show us a report like you just quoted, where clearly it's two dwarfs comparing who is taller than the other, when you mention Uganda and South Sudan, one wants to ask whether indeed, according to today's theme, there's still enough space to navigate press freedom during an electoral period that we're getting into. But you also conclude by talking about the ownership model, and gladly we have Daniel Kalinaki, who works for a media house that's not owned by a leader of a Pentecostal church, in as much as, of course, the owner is a spiritual head of the Ismailis. And he was only recently in Uganda, just last week, to have long conversations with the powers that be. But we also know that probably the media house, Nation Media Group, would be equated to the candy shelf in a huge supermarket that has so many other things on display, from hospitality, banking, and other places that His Royal Highness the Aga Khan does have. And now we bring it to your doorstep, Daniel, on whether, tell us, was the conversation around media freedom, or even the workings of the enemy newspaper, as the president prefers to call your publication, one of the things that made it even to a little whisper between the conversation President Museveni and His Royal Highness the Aga Khan? We'll start there.
Thank you, Simon. When I was coming to the Swedish residence, I did not expect to meet the Swedish house mafia. It turned out to be Simon. So the short answer, Simon, is that I was not privy to the conversations between His Highness the Aga Khan and the presidency. But as you mentioned, there's lots of investments across different sectors. So it was at the invitation of the president, and the president has had a very long relationship with the former Aga Khan. So usually there's a lag. I think the diplomats will know there's a lag between when the discussions happen and when things happen.
Like that.
But I just kind of wanted to say something about your question to William about media freedom. I think there is, to my view, both a supply and demand deficit of media freedom, in the sense that the institutions that are supposed to guarantee or work towards or kind of facilitate media freedom are either non-existent or doing very little of what they're supposed to do. And that can be kind of a self-serving argument if you spend your day in a newsroom. The thing that's most chilling for me is the lack of demand. It's the demand side, because for a long time, those of us in the media thought that these facts were self-evident. We thought that the importance of a strong and professional and independent media industry that holds power accountable, that asks difficult questions, was, that the importance of that was well known, was established, was not something that we needed to make song and dance about. It's shocking just the low levels of media literacy and the low appreciation of the need for institutions. And I think it feeds into a much bigger problem, which, I think aligned to the theme of international democracy, is the broader retreat of democracy. Across the world, I would say, even in countries that we thought had built democracy into their DNAs after the violence of the first half of the last century. But you kind of then see just the whole sense of institutional integrity, of power being held accountable, of people having the legroom to speak and to ask questions, being eroded. And in the countries where democracy was still in its very early stages, William speaks about RSF. Freedom House, I think, shows a very worrying trend where after 88, there is kind of an increase in countries that were previously not free becoming freer, kind of a supply of democracy post-Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. Then that kind of tapers off around 2005, after the war against terror. So the conversation becomes securitized. Then you have the economic crisis in 2008, which then begins to kind of shake the underlying premise of democracy. Democracy for what sake? So you see in countries where there's been economic inequality, people have been left behind, then people kind of beginning to bang at the door, the barbarians at the gate. Initially, we thought it was just the poor emerging countries, so the Arab Spring, the Middle East, long undemocratic countries. But now, very clearly, it's a problem that is in Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, across the pond in America. So I think I'm more troubled about the state of democracy generally, and in our local circumstances, the lack of demand for institutional integrity, for media freedom, and for government that serves the public.
Daniel, I have a very complicated question to that. There is a tendency to imagine, at least from what we've seen, the narrative that's been built, that democracy is this Western import onto Uganda. And yet we had also, like Europe had their own incredible, difficult civil wars, we had a terrible civil war here. And in 1995, the constitution that we brought out, I was only 2 years old at that point, the constitution that was produced was the outcome of a very democratic engagement. That constitution produced a Bill of Rights. That constitution said, there's free market so people could start their own businesses. And one of the successful businesses has been the media. You can't run away from that. One of the most successful businesses from that constitution has been the media. And yet, now, when the Ugandan constitution has come under increasing challenge and more young people have joined the fray, are unable to find jobs, are angry at the state systems and institutions, no one is saying there's this thing we did in 1995 where we put together a constitution, and maybe if it's not working, can we then discuss democratically how to arrive at a system of governance? Instead, what we are seeing more is the securitization of the problem, which is what created the civil war in the first place. So would you say it's a crisis of confidence in the constitution itself, or a crisis in the confidence of democracy as a system of governance?
You said complicated? Very complicated. I think there are very many themes in there. The easiest to dispense with is successful media industry. I think we confuse proliferation with success. I think it's more of quantity rather than quality, in my view. Speak about civil war. I've seen reports that show just the sheer number of armed violent conflicts in Uganda, I think, is one of the highest even on the continent, which is saying something, if you're an African state. But then you raise the question of constitutionality and then, democracy. I think what happened with the constitution, in my view, was the constitution was more of an imposition with some degree of participation. I do not think that the constitution necessarily represented the will of the majority of the people. The conversation that needed to have happened before the constitution making process of saying, who are we as a country? Who are we as a people? How do we want to govern ourselves? What are the issues that we need to resolve? We never had that conversation. We had attempted to have it in 1961, 62, as we became a nation. It flared up in 66 with the Uganda crisis. It then disappeared under Idi Amin. The first attempt was Moshi, which unfortunately failed. Then you had, the war, and then the process. The NRA, the government that took power, was a military government that then went to great lengths to layer itself with the political kind of credentials by co-opting, the former political parties, trying to build a big church. But if you look critically, and the Daily Monitor and our platforms have been kind of teasing out the Constitution at 30 journey, what ended up in the Constitution in very specific and important instances did not reflect the will of the people. And the contradictions that we had inherited as a country, particularly, for instance, just to take one example, the Uganda question, many of the Uganda elite and the monarchy supported the NRA and the NRM with the either implied or tacit promise that there would be a return to a federal system of government once the government took power. What happens with the run-up to the constitution-making process and within the Constituent Assembly processes itself was an undermining of that attempt to then return Uganda to the federal or the pre-66 state of affairs. So you arrive at a point whereby the Constitution, remember, was written, the country was still at war. Speaking of civil war, the North essentially was a no-go zone. So the views of the people of Northern Uganda, for instance, I'm not sure were reflected in the document. We had unresolved questions of economic strategy. There were unresolved questions of land. So if you look at some of the issues that we're dealing with as a country today, the Constitution did not solve them. So if it was a genuine reflection of the will of the people, it would have solved the Uganda question, it would have resolved the land question, it would have resolved the northern question, it would have agreed to some kind of elite bargain, a grand elite bargain between the political and the economic actors. What really happened was a military victory that then got dressed up with the robes of constitutionalism.
Well, just to follow up through there, Daniel, you did talk about something that really intrigued me quite a bit. You talked about the demand deficit from the side of media relations and the democratic process. one would imagine that the general populace may have its own challenges in demanding for their own rights because they're a mass of one, perhaps homogeneous group of people. But even more homogeneous and smaller are you, the practitioners in the media. You just mentioned that you are on the Editors Guild. And one would want to shine the spotlight on some of these institutions like the ones we call NIJU, the Media Council, the Editors Guild. Can you just describe how much of it, and please take this in good stride, just help us understand how much of a lame duck all of you are, that you are unable to provide some serious demand from the powers that be, at least for nothing else, a little bit of respect and consideration in allowing you to do your work in the framework of our governance and politics vis-a-vis your rights?
I don't think it's just lame duck. I think the institutions that you cite are actually dead.
Okay. I was being very kind.
NIJU and UNEPA, which were the institutions that were codified in the 1995 Press and Journalist Act, have actually become moribund. The reasons, are neither here nor there. I think when I speak about institutionalism and the importance of building institutions that, for instance, outlive their founders. I was in the newsroom when NIJU was, and William was as well, when NIJU was actually a strong and vibrant organization, bringing, policy papers, speaking to the government. All the people that led NIJU, when the effects of the economic liberalization entered the newsroom, in other words, when money became accessible and services became inaccessible, that
I love that.
that contradiction then sucked talent out of the newsrooms. So what you then ended up with, and what Raymond confuses as success, is really a proliferation of, very low rate music playing and joke peddling entities that also then get called media houses, right? So, and the reason that happens is, I think part of it is demographic. The fact that you just have a young country and, there's been the disruption of, digital, channels, et cetera. But the morass that you see in the media industry, in my opinion, is reflected in the morass that you see in other institutions of the state, like Parliament, for instance, like the civil service, like the judiciary. It's even reflected in institutions like the religious institutions. So it's not, would be comparing the height of dwarfs if we thought that the media industry, because it's slightly more articulate, is in a better position. I think I mourn not for the media industry. I worry for the state of institutional culture and governance in the country generally.
So, Dr. William Taibwa, it's therefore safe to say from what Daniel has just shared with us that press freedom and everything around it, the challenge to that is not so much the state, but perhaps the challenge, in fact, is at the very core within the media space itself. And every time such an argument is made, like Daniel just did, that there's a lot of proliferation of what would have been very strong individuals in newsrooms now getting out to do other things. I'm normally used as a postcard image of that because I thought that when I was getting to my prime, then the EU snatched me and I've never since gone back to the newsroom. Maybe if I'd remained in the newsroom, I would now be a little bit of a colossus. Now I'm being referred to as a veteran, and yet I have no strand of gray hair in my head, except the loss of it. So would one therefore say safely that the challenge of what we're discussing is not so much the state, but our own constitution as journalism, and therefore the solutions cannot be asked from the state, but should be a point of introspection within the media space and the practitioners therein to try and see how best they can strengthen themselves, galvanize themselves, create institutions at last, make sure that the media council, no matter how much of a leg they have into the state, but they are also so much leaned to the whims and fancies of the industry, as it were.
I think there is value in what you are saying, Simon, that a point of introspection is very important. But I take solace in the fact that we have already quite interesting models that we can look at, where the media is occupying that particular space. So you look at models where citizens have taken that important space to engage in important conversations. I think for me that is very important. And this is coming from someone who is teaching journalism, where my job is to teach the principles of the profession and upholding accuracy and balance and being accountable and truthfulness and those wonderful principles of the profession. And yet the successful models of functioning media seem to be outside that. And what I mean here, I can just give one example. So those of you in this country, I think you are familiar with the Bukede model. I may call it the Bukede model. So those who do not understand what the Bukede model is, really it is citizen journalism. The citizens out there, they grab the camera, they grab the tools of our trade, and they have not been to my journalism school. And they take issues in their hand and they do the journalism. And it happens to be the journalism that is thriving in this country. And when I say thriving, I mean, Daniel, I don't know whether the numbers are important, but I think they are. I was very intrigued to see that Bukede, the newspaper, the television, beats in terms of listenership and in terms of readership, the English dailies in this country.
All of them combined, by the way, not just one.
All of them combined.
On one day.
So a journalism model where the citizens just took the microphone away from us and the newsrooms took the bait. So that is something of introspection for me, Simon. That's the first point of introspection for us. But also, Simon, look at some of the entities that are coming up. I mean, I'm intrigued by Grab a Coffee.
I knew you were heading there.
I am heading there. And but in that space, you have other youth-led media initiatives, the Media Challenge Initiative, who are very, very creative, and they are setting up things like fact-checking and debunking, fake news. I can see Miriam in the room, and I know she's been very active in that space. And so this, to me, these are very interesting spaces where of introspection, first of all, but also of saying maybe the conventional traditional model of doing journalism is not working, and therefore think outside the box and look at other existing models. I cannot leave the platform without mentioning the amazing work that is being done by the African Institute for Investigative Journalism. I mean, Daniel would want to do very serious, tough, deep investigations that take days, like the one we just saw coming out of the BBC. But that costs a lot of money. But the fact that you have, entities like the African Institute for Investigative Journalism that is dedicating, time and effort to do this kind of journalism, I think that is very important. I think those are the spaces where we are claiming that space, and we should not, I think, feel very exasperated.
So you're getting into the room through the window as opposed to using the front door.
I think
Come on in, Raymond.
No. I was going to say, I'm going to put one of my friends in the audience to task, Halima Athumani. So if someone can get a microphone to her, I'll ask her later about models of journalism. But as the microphone gets to her, Daniel, I want to ask you this important thing. One of the other pillars of democracy is trust. Mm-hmm. And for me, the trust issue is two-form. We say that people have abandoned traditional media. Mm-hmm. But when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, we saw the numbers on traditional media go up again. people saw things on their TikToks, but they still came back to the media houses to say, is this thing true? Is it not? In terms of repurposing what traditional media is doing, are you seeing those as trends that you can do? Because breaking news is no longer as important to many people. They can get it off their timelines. What is appealing to younger audiences in a country like Uganda now is broad. We've seen vloggers who do content that we traditionally thought should not be on the media, but has a great amount of interaction.
Yeah.
And democracy also demands free expression. So sometimes you have to recognize that that is an element of free expression. So are you sitting back as a media executive and saying, maybe this is a learning moment? Or are you sitting back and saying, people will come back to us someday?
First, people are already with us. Good. The biggest news platforms by reach, by audience, remain mainstream media. I think there is a place, a much needed place for alternative media houses, smaller startups, AIIJ, MCI, etc. I think they play a complementary role to mainstream media as opposed to a substituting role. And the more the merrier. I genuinely believe there's something about, and I think Barbara will not be very pleased with me saying this, but Barbara Kaija, who's my counterpart at Vision Group, and I found ourselves one day in an office, which I will not name, where we had been summoned.
It's free expression, Swedish land.
Yes, on a live podcast.
Although by that we can already guess which office that was.
And the powers that be kind of read the Riot Act, etc., etc. And she said something that I found very profound. And she said, can you imagine how the next election would be without the New Vision and the Monitor? I think the power of mainstream media is not necessarily in the big flashing lights. I think it's in the small local news, it's in the small court stories, it's in the story of a widow who's had her house taken by some rich, powerful person. And then the aggregation of that content, allowing you to put a finger to the pulse of the society, the country. It does not mean that mainstream media are beyond reproach. I think there are things that we must do to become more relevant. There are things that we must stop doing because they have very low nutritional calorific value. Right? But I think that the startups play an important role on top of rather than substituting. And we've seen this in more mature media markets. A few years ago, when the rise of Vice and BuzzFeed and Vox, was all the rage in the United States, everyone believed that mainstream media was dying or were dying, and these new startups are going to be. But how many do you have to read to get, a composite of society? So I think one of the things that we suffer from, and which as a minimum we needed to have sorted out, was to ensure that we have a functional, independent, and professional state broadcaster.
Yeah.
Right? So that even if you don't agree with the politics of a particular media house, even if you don't agree with, the ownership of a particular media house, that you have a relatively unfiltered and unbiased and straight-faced, point and shoot version of events. Things happening in parliamentary committees, things happening in courts, things happening in, government ministries, in cabinet, in state house, etc., etc. So the point, I think, I don't know as Raymond or Simon mentioned it earlier, in terms of the appreciation for media, in my mind, I don't really, and by the way, the numbers for Bukede, William, I'll let you know.
Oh, okay.
Okay. It's a live broadcast.
I knew we were going there.
They were always going to be high when they were because of many dynamics. It's a local language platform. It's a tabloid, and they do very good journalism. The Bukade newspaper, say what you may, doff my hat off to some of the editors there. They knew their audience. They were able to tap into something that was relevant and interesting and do it consistently. So what worries me is that the audience that was consuming Bukade with all their, kind of cutting close to the wind content, and the fact that they would always have some solid content in there, that audience is now consuming an endless dopamine scroll on Uganda TikTok. I am not sure that you can build a democratic and accountable society on a dopamine scroll of jokes on TikTok. I would like to see it happen. I hope it happens in my lifetime. I'm not holding my breath for it.
Well, Raymond, you'll allow me try to move this conversation away from the high horse of...
But Raymond and Simon, and incidentally, in journalism school, females are actually our, they are always higher than the number of females are always higher than the number of, in the classes. So in journalism school, we have more females in journalism school. I think, Daniel, you remember that during your time. And after that, they disappear somewhere. I think that's a question that we
into public relations.
Into public relations, that's true.
And you really exemplified something that I have witnessed firsthand. Currently, among the other things I'm doing other than grabbing a coffee and other things I grab, I do a personality profile program called Incredible Life Stories with Simon Kasiaten. This is a platform where I invite folks that have distinguished themselves in various ways in their vocations to share their life stories, if for nothing else, to motivate anyone else that finds themselves in a worse situation than these ones found themselves in but have no hope, but these ones have hope. You'll be surprised at the percentage of my female guests and the male guests. I have men who have nothing really to their names, willing to speak about the little or nothing at all in their lives, as opposed to the myriad of women with incredible life stories. Many of them ordinary ladies, but with extraordinary life stories that would just shock everyone from their seats. But guess what? These ladies will find 1,001 reasons not to be on the podcast, not to be on the program. And for the few that I've managed to get, 99% are usually widowed. So that tells you where the problem is. It means they have to wait for their husbands so they come and tell their life story, which is, a societal thing that we need to look into. But away from that, like I said earlier on, let me try and bring the conversation away from the high horse of academia and all these high-sounding words into what we see manifesting in as far as navigating press freedom in an electoral period is concerned. The postcard image of media freedom in Uganda towards an election is that now journalists, like any other demographic of people in an electoral space, are being targeted specifically. And, beaten some of them, arrested, which was never the case many years ago, or at least when you wore a press tag. Small as it was, sometimes illegible from 1 meter from you, you were never touched, or if you just waved a recorder. Right now, you may even as well carry a 10 by 10 foot billboard saying press or journalist. And that, in fact, will be the reason why the laser mark will be put on you. And the question is, why has it become like that? And for how long can that situation continue getting worse? Because you will agree with me, William and Daniel, that being the vanguard of society that the journalism you call yourselves to be, that used to be a privileged position. Now it isn't anymore. There are some of the media houses, Daniel, I'm sure you know one of them, that right now as we speak is not allowed within a kilometer radius from where the president is having their event. You are not allowed to cover the president. In fact, they cover the president through third parties. And that space is increasing in terms of how many are joining that group.
Can we ask Daniel when he last covered the president?
That would be narrowing it down to Daniel, just maybe his media house, when the last time a member of his media house was within 10 meters of the president.
Last week. But that was because the owner of the business was there. Look,
Exactly.
So Simon, it's very tempting, for us to when we find ourselves like-minded to kind of gather in a tent, flog ourselves, cover ourselves in ashes. What you've described about journalists, very unfortunate, 100% correct. It's also true that for the longest time, you never had lawyers arrested and sent to jail for 9 months in a military court.
Yeah. Okay. Come think about it.
It's also true that for the longest time, you never had civil society organizations
Closed.
being shut down or having their offices broken into.
And diplomats attacked. You want to add that?
Well, I remember, one of the things we used to struggle with was just to get the industry around the table to discuss some of these things. And one of the major players, government owned, was very unenthusiastic until one day, one of their journalists was kidnapped. A journalist in a government-owned and run media house being kidnapped by, an agent of the state. So, as tempting as it is to think of this as a media freedom issue in isolation, it is not. And what should concern us is that not enough people see the extent of the problem and the repercussions of the breakdown in certain normative values in politics and the conduct of society.
Maybe, William, to also come to you on this question, and it could be rhetorical and even a funny question, but do you teach your students now how to protect themselves against security agencies? It's a rhetorical question, but it's an actual question because they are going to get beaten. Do you teach them that?
Yes, we have a module on safety and security of journalists. Safety and security of journalists. I've just been discussing with Miriam actually on a new project that is coming her way. But yes, we teach these principles, and Raymond, I can tell you it is very tough to be where I am, teaching these wonderful people, all these wonderful principles of the profession. And the ethics, the ethics of the profession, not taking a brown envelope. You remember the brown envelope? Don't touch that.
The color hasn't changed. We remember it.
The color hasn't changed. But deep down that I get back to the ownership models of the media here, and you realize that these people, you train them, you give them all these wonderful principles, you send them in the world. If it's not Daniel, who takes very few, they are going to end up in these radio stations that don't need a journalist with a degree, just someone with a good voice, a relative, better, and
the pretty face.
The pretty face to be on TV. That's all they need, not that you've gone to journalism school and you've been exposed to all these principles. But Raymond, also to tell you that actually I'm not seated in journalism school, but I do a lot of outside the university training of journalists up country. So with several media agencies and organizations, civil ground roots organizations, and these issues come up every day. Safety issues, trauma that we rarely talk about. I mean, Robert is here. Robert Sempara, the boss of Human Rights Network for Journalists Uganda, that catalogs all these abuses of a various nature. So yes, we teach that, and we send these people out there, and then they realize that very many things you taught them in journalism school do not apply, and it becomes a continuing challenge. How do you balance because Raymond and Simon, I think the model journalism schools have continued to adopt, and this is something that we ought to rethink, is the libertarian model of how the press ought to function. And we are, of course, in an embassy of a libertarian nation. But you see, those libertarian principles, they are very important, yes. And that's where the model of democracy that we purport to follow is based on that. But there are other models. There are other models of how the press functions. There are other models of democracy. Maybe that's a conversation we may have, not maybe today, but at some point. Do we continue functioning in this model, a libertarian model, in a non-libertarian environment, where we cannot practice what we teach, or we cannot practice what we proclaim, or we take an introspective look at some other models and maybe say, maybe this model is not working for us and we adopt another one. Conversation for another day, Raymond.
One of the things around the press freedom is a difficult relationship the press has with the regulators. And Media Council happens to be one of them. And one of those difficult relationships is on accreditation of journalists. Yeah. Every election cycle, the Media Council tells us we need to have a list of accredited journalists that can cover the election. And oftentimes it might come off as censorship. As you might know, in the last election, we went to the courts of law to challenge that. The Editors Guild challenged that. Are you going to do the same in this coming election so that we prepare the lawsuit early enough?
So as Mr. Jawedi prepares himself to answer that question, maybe I just need briefly, Raymond, if you may, just to, well, not to preempt the remarks to be made by the head of delegation for the European mission, but I remember one of the most interesting engagements I somehow was able to be a fly on the wall was the political dialogue on Article 9 of the Cotonou Agreement. And I remember that when Mr. Kalinaki was talking about the fact that the shrinking freedom space is not only akin to journalism, but is taking other forms of vocations, and he cited lawyers, other demographic people, including and not limited to diplomats. And so I have not been privy to the goings on at the European Union, but one may want to know how, whether or not the Article 9 political dialogue is still going on. Does it still go on? And if it does this really feature? Is it featuring? And if it is, again, guided by your principles, how much are you able to share with us so that maybe we can take comfort in the fact that someone somewhere is holding us in the omnibus of conversations between equal partners, or at least partners that have mutual respect for each other in ameliorating this situation?
Daniel, he's just said a very important thing, that regulation is important. How we go about the regulation is the matter of contention. Are media houses comfortable in this coming election to have accredited journalists by the Media Council of Uganda?
So when the Editors Guild and the Center for Public Interest Litigation challenged the accreditation rule at the last election, it was really on the basis of propriety and legality that the Media Council, which was overseeing that process, was not properly constituted, because its legs, it was a table that had lost two legs and was kind of wobbly. And we had hoped that that litigation would kind of almost force the issue in terms of creating a conversation about what kind of media industry we want, what is fit for the country. I think there are problems within the media industry. There are problems of, Peter mentioned, the extortion, et cetera, Those are well known and they're problematic, and we must do something about them. I also do not think the old argument in the beginning, when the law was written, there were guys who'd been in the media houses for years who did not have degrees. Some of them had come to the city to announce deaths and just kind of stayed in the newsrooms. And they felt that there was, this new crop of, students who just going to university. There was a new, degree program who were going to take their jobs. So the conversation was not really had on its own merits. I think it was bastardized. So in terms of we in the media must also be accountable, and we must be transparent. We cannot claim to be beyond reproach. We cannot claim to be beyond, to be operating above the law. I think the issues are two. It's how do you do it, right? And for what purpose? If you see what has been happening, if you just kind of step back, if you're on the outside looking in, and you take the last election as an example. So you have this fight over accrediting journalists, right? You could hold an opinion one way or the other, and one could argue that you need to know who's coming to cover the election. It's an important event, etc., etc. Then you have the switching off of the internet, right? So if a state switches off the internet around a national electoral process that demands transparency and accountability, is their ask for accreditation of journalists designed to increase or reduce the supply of transparency, right? So the practice, if you then go to people being targeted, I think someone you're saying, journalists, it used to be that if you had a press jacket, right? They took care of you. You were an eyewitness. You're an advocate of the peace and of the truth. If you swing that round, and we had journalists who were being hidden in shops and under beds by civilians, right? From armed people, armed officers of the state. If you put all of that together, you can see why people would be apprehensive at the very least about calls to, register journalists. But just before you go to the audience, the thing that you mentioned, I think, in the beginning about democracy being a Western value, I don't think we should necessarily just try to mimic or come to Western embassies and try to replicate models. I think we should take apart, for it to be sustainable, whether it's constitutionalism or democracy, we should take apart the constituent parts of power and the management of society, because we were not in darkness before colonialism, right? We had structures that managed society, that managed the exchange of power and regulated power. Uganda, for instance, had a very intricate power structure, right, between an absolute monarch, but chiefs who also acted as restraints. We must agree what kind of country we want to build. We must agree what kind of media we want to see. We must have that conversation in and among ourselves. That is the only way we are going to build or legislate or build institutions that actually work for us, right, and serve our own interests. It's to merely take the Stockholm examples and impose them here would not work. It would just leave us with the bitter taste of Stockholm syndrome.
but this is the reason this is difficult for me is also that the hardware of democracy must remain the rule of law, respect for private property. Those are hardware elements that maybe the software can change, but the hardware must remain. And this argument often comes up to say, it comes up at the point when people challenge, say, can you be more accountable? And then people say, but that's a Western model. And they say this when they're holding iPhones, they're wearing fancy suits. I just feel like, the flip-flop of when the argument can be used is just too open. But also you have a young population of 62 different diverse tribes. How else are you going to manage them? I mean, we all don't look at the way Uganda manages itself to manage ourselves. How do you manage the contending constituencies that make up Uganda now?
Raymond, I normally juxtapose that also with the argument, bring it closer to home in terms of journalism, and the argument that for you to be a good journalist, you must have professional academic training in journalism. And you look back and realize some of the best journalists the world has had did not have even one single day in journalism school. And I'm not trying to sound vain, but yes, I can claim to have practiced journalism for 25 years, but not a single day have I been in journalism school. Now, what does that mean? It means that I made a conscious decision to practice a trade I am not training in, but certain things will have to remain sacrosanct, which are the ethos of journalism. Truthfulness, objectivity, and everything that you get to pick up in the field. I won't get in there and act like a lone ranger running around simply because I have a good voice, I can talk fast and all that, and forfeit all the other ethos that should carry me through in the practice of the trade. Matter of fact, when I entered the newsroom, I had been invited to the university to study, anyone wants to guess? Veterinary medicine. And I had a choice to make, to either study a course where my patients would as well serve as my meal, or to go into a profession that I love to do naturally, not study it, but follow the ethos and the rules in the newsroom. Likewise for democracy, if you choose that you're going to get into the space of management of society along the ethos of, proper governance, accountability, you don't have to make the argument that it's Stockholm transplanted into Kampala. Just do exactly that, or else find another model and don't call it democracy. I'll take it back to you.
So I don't think a degree makes you a good journalist or a bad journalist. When I hire, I never really care about what you studied. In fact, for many years, at the Nation Media Group, we actively looked for people who hadn't studied journalism so that we could take their broader worldviews and then teach them the skill of journalism. I think we confuse academic qualification with being able to hold someone accountable. And I'm all for people in the media being held accountable, right? Regardless of their academic qualifications, they must paint within the lines in terms of defamation, for instance, in terms of libel. They should not incite violence, right? And those that do should go through a fair, transparent, and legal process of redress. So, that's pretty much settled in my mind. But the thing about it becoming a Western, imposition thing is that with democracy, I now think that we got an oversupply of democracy.
I love that. How
Before society, for instance, had created the classes that can hold it together, right? So you've gone from a new constitution. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. If the constitution was a good document and reflected the will of the people, its two strongest handbrake rules and it's a very powerful, that constitution gives a lot of power to the president. And the understanding was that it would give a lot of power to the presidency, but it would limit how long one individual held that power, right?
True.
The fact that it kept the power and removed
the length, the duration.
It removed the restrictions, the duration, contributes to a lot of the problems that if I became president today, I would probably do worse than the next person just because of how much power.
I can attest.
We know that for a fact, Daniel.
But what has happened is that the institutions that were supplied as evidence of democracy, right, were supplied in form rather than substance. So you have parliament, but parliament is very easy to put under the thumb of the executive if you commercialize the politics and you control the money. The judiciary is very easy to put under the thumb of the executive if the executive is there for a very long time and is able to then appoint cadre judges down the line. The civil service, same thing, right? So you then end up with a box ticking exercise. You want you want regular elections? Yes. Are they free and fair? Well, there's a substantiality rule, right? Would they have affected the outcome? Probably not, right? How do you measure the outcome of someone being shot dead at a polling station, right? You can't count it. So it's an impossible hill to climb, which is my core argument is that rather than simply accept institutions or edicts or things that we think work in other places, we need to have conversations that lead to a new grand elite bargain about what kind of country we want, what kind of institutions, and how we're going to manage power, both political and economic power within the country.
Thank you so much to everyone who's been part of this conversation. You've been listening to a very special podcast of the International Day of Democracy done by Grab a Coffee Podcast, the Swedish Embassy, and the EU in Uganda. This brings to a close our podcast. I beg you, please do not move until you hear that jingle so that we can close the recording of today's podcast. So our producers will play the final jingle and the podcast will be closed. But thank you so much, everyone, for making time for this conversation. I believe there's a network and reception after here, but Hassan is going to guide us about what happens next after here. So let's wait for the jingle and then close out.